Welcome to Gen AI Pulse, your daily tech update. Today, we are discussing what is, I would argue, the biggest strategic bet in the history of generative AI infrastructure, Meta's recently announced Meta Compute Initiative. This plan isn't just about building more data centers, it's really a declaration that infrastructure is the new competitive moat. Mark Zuckerberg has said the company aims to drastically scale its compute, targeting tens of gigawatts this decade and hundreds of gigawatts or more over time. I mean, that level of scale is it's completely unprecedented.
It really is.
So the central question we need to wrestle with today is whether this monumental, vertically integrated commitment is a feasible strategic play that will secure Meta's long-term AI leadership, or if the sheer scale makes the project inherently vulnerable to the looming physical and logistical constraints that are already crushing the data center industry in 2026. My position is that Meta's scale and strategic partnerships are not only necessary, but they represent the only proactive measure that guarantees a competitive advantage in the AI race.
And I come at it from a very different perspective. While the ambition is certainly attention-grabbing, I believe the numerical targets are wildly out of sync with our current infrastructure realities. So my position is that the stated goals are functionally incompatible with the pace of global power, grid, and supply chain development. And we're not talking about minor inconveniences here. The constraints facing massive infrastructure projects in 2026, whether it's access to clean power or critical components, these are fundamental limitations of physics and logistics that I think even Meta's immense capital and political muscle may struggle to overcome on their aggressive timetable. They're trying to move at the speed of software when they're building in the world of concrete, copper, and utility regulation.
Well, I think that comparison is precisely why Meta has pursued this aggressive vertical integration. They recognize that infrastructure has become the binding constraint on AI expansion, and they've mobilized their entire organization to treat it that way. The move to unify data center and network oversight under Meta Compute, that's a fundamental architectural reorganization. We see Santosh Janardhan driving the internal technical architecture, the silicon program, and physical operations, while external efforts, led by Daniel Gross on capacity planning and Dina Powell-McCormick on government diplomacy and financing, work in lockstep. So this isn't just a tech project, it's a whole corporate structuring designed to solve a capacity crisis. And the results are already visible. Securing access to up to 6.6 gigawatts of nuclear power from partners like TerraPower, Oklo, and Vistra. That is a game changer. That capacity is stable, it's emissions-free, and most importantly, it represents a strategic long-term hedge against escalating power costs and regulatory pushback. This scale is the non-negotiable requirement for delivering what they call personal superintelligence to billions.
Okay, that's a compelling argument about strategic necessity. But let's be really precise about the context of that scale. Tens of gigawatts by 2030 is astronomical. It dwarfs the needs of any conventional cloud architecture, and it makes other massive plans, like OpenAI's 10-gigawatt Stargate, seem almost modest by comparison. The issue isn't the ambition, it's the time gap. Yes, Meta is vertically integrated and can build a physical data center shell rapidly, maybe in, 18 to 24 months? But the electricity infrastructure, the high-voltage transmission lines, the substations, the connection permits, that takes vastly longer. Global averages for securing a grid connection range from 2 years on the very low end, but can stretch up to a decade in densely regulated markets like parts of the EU. Meta cannot build a nuclear plant or get a major transmission line approved faster than the regulatory and engineering realities allow. And that mismatch between quick construction and slow utility integration, that is the critical bottleneck. Meta's money doesn't override the laws of physics or governmental permitting schedules. I see why you think the timeline conflict is insurmountable, but I would frame Meta's geography strategy a bit differently. Meta is explicitly leveraging a crucial technical distinction that helps unlock faster development. AI training workloads are significantly less latency reliant than, say, cloud or AI inference workloads. And this strategic freedom allows them to move massive facilities dedicated solely to training out of congested urban areas. Think Dublin or Amsterdam, where grid queues are effectively closed, and locate them in more remote areas where power availability is higher and land is cheaper.
They can locate them, yes. But does moving them to the Northern Ireland coast, for example, genuinely solve the utility scale problem?
I mean, they might find available power on paper, but they are still competing for a generation that needs to be built and transmitted. And when you cite the 6.6 gigawatt nuclear commitment, we have to acknowledge that those projects are predominantly small modular reactors, SMRs. While promising, these are advanced designs that will take years, I'd say 3 to 5 at a minimum, to achieve regulatory sign-off, let alone physical completion and scaling. So that capacity is essentially theoretical for the near term. The fundamental problem is that Meta is entering a hyper-competitive market for finite resources, turbines, transformers, great connection slots, where even the alternatives like natural gas generation have years-long lead times for critical components. The inertia of the grid is it's incompatible with the acceleration of AI demand.
But their strategy is not passive, it's about active mitigation. By strategically placing these massive training hubs in regions that might have ample wind or hydro resources, or that are proactively building new nuclear generation, Meta is bypassing the grid congestion crisis of the Tier 1 markets. And on top of that, they are adapting their construction methodology. By utilizing modular construction and advanced building expertise, they can manage the complexities of these remote builds much more efficiently. They aren't waiting for the grid, they are going where the available power will be. Going where the power will be is still contingent on 2 other major infrastructure constraints that remote locations actually make worse: skilled labor and connectivity. Building hyperscale facilities in these remote regions means increased logistical costs for transporting materials and, crucially, a major challenge in securing the specialized labor force needed for these high-density, cutting-edge AI data centers. More fundamentally, while training might be less latency-sensitive than inference, it still requires massive, reliable fiber connectivity back to the core network. Are these remote sites really capable of supporting the multi-terabit backbones needed to feed and pull data from gigawatt-scale clusters?
And that brings us directly to the next critical point: supply chain pressure. You are right that construction logistics are complex, but Meta is actively mitigating this risk by prioritizing flexibility and diversification, which affects both components and compute capacity.
You mentioned competition for compute. Well, Meta is insulating itself through multi-billion-dollar cloud deals with rivals and partners like Google, CoreWeave, and Oracle. This portfolio approach lessens their singular reliance on securing millions of chips from just one source. And more importantly, their internal silicon program gives them control over the design of the processor, allowing them to optimize it specifically for their own unique power, cooling, and network constraints. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that these partnerships and self-design efforts insulate them from the most fundamental bottlenecks. The source material is very clear. The current global supply chain strain is driven by shortages of foundational electrical equipment, not just processors. Critical components like transformers, large switchgear, and customized power management units, they're sold out for several years across the board. The largest OEMs are locked into massive, multi-year contracts, leaving everyone else scrambling. So whether Meta builds its own data center or leases capacity from a partner, those physical constraints on core high-voltage electrical infrastructure remain. The scarcity of copper, steel, specialized ceramics, driven partly by geopolitical complexity and trade restrictions, that is a global reality that even Meta cannot solve with a partnership deal. They may secure their chips, but they won't have the gear to power them. But that is precisely why their push toward modularity and localized supply partnerships is so key.
Instead of ordering a massive, custom substation from one constrained international vendor with a 5-year lead time, Meta is leveraging modular, highly customizable power systems.
These systems are designed to adapt to unconventional or constrained sites more easily, and that reduces their reliance on these massive, monolithic, internationally constrained supply lines. By working with localized partners who have in-house engineering and assembly capabilities, they can utilize smaller, more flexible components that are assembled closer to the deployment site. This adaptation maximizes the usable capacity within limited parcels of land, bypassing some of those traditional component delays. They are trying to disrupt the typical utility procurement model.
They are certainly trying to disrupt it, but the laws of thermodynamics still apply. And this leads us to the technical bottlenecks that this scale introduces, which I find particularly challenging. Even assuming they manage to overcome the component scarcity, they then face the operational reality of these ultra-massive clusters. We are talking about racks that are trending toward 250 kilowatts by 2030. That is a small neighborhood substation powering a single row of cabinets. The sheer density creates what analysts are calling the reflex gap.
Could you elaborate on the reflex gap for our audience on Gen I Pulse?
Absolutely. Think of the GPU as the brain, processing data in microseconds, almost instantly. But the network, the fiber, the switches, the optical interconnects, that acts as the nervous system, delivering this massive influx of training data. As clusters grow, the distance and complexity increase, meaning data delivery can take milliseconds. That time difference, microseconds versus milliseconds, that is the reflex gap. And when you run billions of dollars worth of compute capacity, and the network can't keep the GPUs fed with data fast enough, you get processing stalls. This just kills efficiency at the hyperscale level. It forces us to need rapid, profound evolution in networking to maintain high bandwidth and ultra-low latency. It intensifies pressure on switch silicon and optical supply chains, potentially impeding a real-time application performance and the massive utilization rates Meta needs to make this investment profitable.
That's a very clear articulation of the challenge, though I would frame Meta's response not as a struggle against the reflex gap, but as a strategic attempt to pioneer the solution. Meta is explicitly treating networking as a primary constraint, not some side issue. Their strategy involves integrating power, cooling, and networking considerations far more closely than ever before. They aren't just buying faster gear, they are engineering a new nervous system. They are leveraging advanced proprietary architectures like the disaggregated scheduled fabric.
And what does that fabric actually achieve?
Well, essentially, the disaggregated scheduled fabric is Meta's way of internally decoupling compute and networking resources. It allows them to manage the allocation of power and resources dynamically, ensuring the network can deliver data efficiently and keep the expensive GPUs saturated, avoiding those costly processing stalls you mentioned. They're deploying new 51 terabit per second switches and targeting significant backbone growth. This strategic integration is specifically designed to balance energy consumption and heat dissipation with performance, aiming for resilience and high utilization at the gigawatt scale. They have identified the constraint and are attempting to engineer their way out of it through architectural innovation. That's the very definition of strategic advantage. They are certainly investing heavily in the architecture, but the physical ecosystem still has to deliver. Their internal fabric relies on the constant, high-speed delivery of increasingly complex physical components, faster optical interconnects, greater fiber capacity, and specialized switch silicon. The pressure on those manufacturing segments will just intensify dramatically. Again, the challenge remains the timeline. Can the global manufacturing and utility ecosystems, which rely on long planning horizons, evolve at the accelerated pace Meta's software and architecture teams are setting? I remain deeply skeptical. The sheer inertia required to build utility-scale infrastructure is massive, and Meta is currently pushing against that inertia with unprecedented force. At the end of the day, I see Meta Compute as an existential effort that correctly identifies the infrastructure crunch as the single greatest strategic vulnerability for any AI leader. By aggressively pursuing vertical integration, locking in those 6.6 gigawatt energy partnerships, and proactively diversifying their supply chain and architectural strategies, Meta is taking the necessary, large-scale steps required to secure the foundational compute capacity for future AI leadership. They are not merely reacting to the constraints, they are adapting their entire corporate structure and procurement model to address them. That level of comprehensive commitment is a strategic asset few others can match.
And while the ambition is undeniable and the executive team they've mobilized is absolutely top tier, the physics and the economics of building foundational utility infrastructure simply do not bend easily to software development timelines. The tens of gigawatts goal crashes directly into immutable lead times for grid expansion, utility permitting, and the long backlog for critical components like transformers and switchgear. Meta will undoubtedly secure significant capacity, perhaps more than any competitor, but I believe its stated timetable and scale for 2030 are fundamentally unrealistic given the systemic constraints shaping the data center world in 2026. They will succeed in building a giant infrastructure, but they won't meet their announced targets.
Determine whether Meta's strategic resources and high-level diplomatic efforts can defy the systemic constraints that the broader industry acknowledges as a perfect storm.
Thank you for joining us for this segment of Gen I Pulse.
We'll be back soon to continue the debate.